Welcome to The Next Stop Is with me, Jane August, my podcast where I get to chat with New York City's culture makers. And this is a very special episode because I was and still am a theater kid. When I moved to New York City, I spent so much time seeing shows on and off Broadway, and I became so fascinated with the physical spaces and the history that happened in those spaces. And today I am joined by the expert of New York City theater spaces, Jennifer Ashley Tepper. She is a theater historian, an author, a producer. She does so much stuff. She's the creative and programming director at 54 Below. There, she has curated or produced over 7,000 shows, including the award-winning concert series If It Only Even Runs a Minute. She's written several books, including the Untold Stories of Broadway book series, which has 4 volumes so far. And a few months ago, she released Women Writing Musicals, The Legacy That the History Left Out, which is the first ever book about female musical theater writers. And then as a producer, she's produced major productions of Be More Chill, Broadway Bounty Hunter, and Love and Hate Nation through her collaborations with the Joe Iconis and family. She's worked on Broadway shows in other capacities, curated at the Museum of Broadway, and she was the historian consultant on the Tick, Tick, Boom movie. And she is the brain behind the Jonathan Larson Project, which had a concert premiere back in 2018, but is now a full production starting previews this February at the Orpheum Theater off-Broadway. Welcome, Jen.
Jane, that was such a wonderful introduction. I'm so honored that you have me on, and I also am just like, can you just walk around and give my bio to people? Thank you.
You do so much. I was trying to be like, how do I make this list of questions that doesn't take hours?
I appreciate that. You know, I've been so enmeshed in the Jonathan Larson Project right now that I feel like it's all my brain wants to go to. So it'll be so fun to talk about that and then to also talk about other things.
So to start, like, how did you fall in love with theater? What was your introduction?
So I grew up in Boca Raton, Florida, very far from New York. And I was really lucky in that my family all loved and appreciated theater. So I was taken to see touring productions. I got to go to theater camp. I did Annie at age 9 at theater camp. And I never looked back. I went to theater camp for 10 years. I was really lucky to go to a high school that had a wonderful theater program, amazing high school theater teacher. Shout out to Miss Haskell. And I just loved it. And every Hanukkah, I would ask for 8 cast albums. That's always like the anecdote I give because it's so indicative of where I was at. Like I just wanted to study theater from afar. From a very early age, I knew it was just musical theater or bust, and it was New York or bust.
Did you know you were going to do theater in this capacity, that you were going to do the history stuff?
You know, I think it's so interesting because when you're a kid and you start doing theater, I feel like, you know, for most of us, you don't know that you can do anything but perform. Like it's a slow process to go, oh, wait, someone directs the show and someone produces the show and someone writes the show. And I was so passionate about like teaching my friends about musicals, like so many of us are. Like, you know, my passion was like to go to theater camp and perform. I loved it, but I also loved going to theater camp and being like, have you guys heard the last 5 years? And like, do you know who Norbert Leo Butz is? I'm specifically just talking about the last 5 years, apparently. But no, it was everything. And going to high school theater, like Thespians was such a big and impactful part of my education. And that was all about performing, but it was also about like picking material and what shows are we going to see and who's singing what song. And so from a very early age, I became obsessed with new musicals, with underappreciated musicals, with corners of theater history that maybe people didn't know about and I was excited about and thought they should. And I think that it put my historian brain and my producer brain and all of the things I do now, it put those in my orbit at a young age, even if I didn't quite know I was studying them. You know, I would get Playbill magazine, even though I didn't live in New York, and I would like memorize what was playing at each theater. So I feel like even though I didn't know what a historian was yet, and I didn't know that I would have the path I had, I was like planting the seeds for it even then.
How do you get into that work? How do you like become a theater historian?
You know, it's so interesting because I feel like there's no one path. I feel like there's a lot of theater historians that are professors. There are some that are directors. There are some that write books. There are some that are artistic directors. And really, it's not like a job you can apply for. It's more like a title that you get based on a body of work. So much of the work in my career that has led to paid jobs over and over, paid jobs and also like really rewarding long-term work has started out as like fun times with friends. And I say that because it's a phrase that the title of Show Gang, who gave me like my first real professional job in theater, used to say fun times with friends. And their fun times with friends were creating a musical that they cared about and that they worked really hard on and getting it from a festival to off-Broadway to Broadway. So it's like, it's not to be reductive about fun times with friends. Like sometimes that can go to the highest artistic level. But so much of the work that I've done, like my collaboration with Joe Iconis started out as like, hey, can I, be a PA on your concert? Can I help out with the show? Can I do anything to assist? And, creating my own work, creating the If It Only Runs a Minute concert series, which was just me and my collaborator Kevin Michael Murphy going like, we want to celebrate underappreciated musicals. Who can we invite to perform and tell stories, and what can we do to put that on stage? That really led to like my book series, so many of the things that I created myself led to historian related work or theater related work that then became a job. And I say that to like anyone who's starting out who wants to carve their own path. Like there were so many years I spent in New York where I was doing day jobs and I was doing babysitting and tutoring, and then I would like get to assist on a musical for a week, or I would get to study with someone I admired for a week. And all of that contributed to this like path I think I've had of, creating stuff myself and working with people I want to work with, and that leading somewhere that became a job.
Are there other people doing work to the level you are? I feel like every Playbill article, anything that's like, we need to know what the theater history is, they always call you.
There are so many theater experts. That's really nice, though. I'm always happy to represent it because I do think there were so many theater historians that I admired when I was growing up who wrote books or who were people that were experts referred to in articles. And a lot of them were mostly like, male artists. And so I was excited to girl power, be a female theater historian. But there are really wonderful people that are doing it now. There are some journalists I know that are pretty great theater experts. A lot of times I see what's so interesting to me. Theater historianism and theater expertism is like getting a new avenue from the internet. And sometimes I'll see from new media, from TikTok or from Facebook groups or any form of social media that people are really, running with that and sharing theater history through these new mediums that, I'm sure some of those will turn into books or articles or, not to differentiate so much between paid and unpaid because it's all valid and valuable work. But I think that the internet has democratized the way that you can rise up in that world. And I've seen people that started out as bloggers related to theater history turn into journalists at theater websites related to theater history. So there are some pretty cool people that honestly I would call to ask a question, but I'm always honored when I get the call.
And then you're producing stuff at the same time. So are you consciously aware that you are also creating theater history, and how do you ride that line of being the one who writes it, but then also the one who kind of creates it, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it's so funny because I feel like all of it impacts all of it. And it's one of the reasons why I think that I'm so happy multi-hyphenates in theater are becoming so much more of a thing, because I think it only makes you a better actor if you're also a writer. I think it only makes you a better costume designer if you're also a photographer. And it's everything that I do, the Jonathan Larson Project, we're creating this musical that I've worked on for 10 years. And the creator, the writer, is not in the room. And without all of my experiences working with living musical theater writers as collaborators, as friends, as people in the rehearsal room, I don't think I would have the right experience to make decisions for this completely different musical theater writer. But I feel like my experiences with the musical theater writers I know has helped me guide that show in the way that it needs to be guided. So it's interesting how, the historian stuff affects the producer stuff. I constantly feel like I couldn't program 54 Below if I hadn't written my books, because that gave me so many, avenues of understanding for what artists do, but it also gave me literal connections to so many artists. So it all kind of feeds into one thing. And there's just so many different hats that kind of make each other stronger.
I guess we can start talking about books because you have so many. So you just put out Women Writing Musicals, The Legacy That the History Books Left Behind. You've been writing theater history books for a while. When did you realize that this one needed to be written?
I was so excited to write this book because so many reasons, but I really got inspired to write it during deep COVID, during early 2020, I thought to myself, what is the project that I would want to do if I had time that I haven't had time to do before? And it was partially, we were all sitting in our apartments and it was so isolating and it was so sad. And I definitely was depressed and when am I going to see my friends, and when am I going to go back to work, and when am I going to leave my apartment? And I thought okay, how can I turn this around? And so I haven't really talked about this much, but I actually wrote 4 books during deep COVID. One was the Untold Stories of Broadway Volume 4, which was published during COVID. One was Women Writing Musicals, The Legacy That the History Books Left Out. And 2 of them no one will ever read because my thing was I want to just do this as an exercise. And one is a book of funny essays, I would say. And I actually think it's pretty good, but it's like personal, and I don't know if I'll ever do anything with it. And the other one is like a historic fiction theater novel that I always wanted to know if I could write, and it is horrible. It is so bad, and it made me have so much more respect than I already did for writers of novels and dramatists, because I am not a dramatist. It's like being a baseball coach who can't play baseball. So anyway, but women writing musicals, I was so excited when I started researching it to find all of this information about women I didn't know. You know, I was so excited to write about Betty Comden and Janine Tesori and Mickey Grant and, you know, Lynn Ahrens, but I had no idea that I would find such remarkable stories of women who we really have completely left out of the narrative. And part of that is like there are such a large volume of like any writer in any category that gets left out because there's just a large volume of musicals. And so I wanted to tell the stories of women who, you know, we should know their names more. They accomplished, you know, triumphant things. And then also I want to talk about the musicals themselves. And when I started researching it, I was just so excited that I could listen to a Gretchen Cryer and Nancy Ford album, and then I could read about women in the 1920s, like writing musicals during the Roaring 20s. And it was so fun and inspiring that I really wrote all of it for the most part in 2020. And then it took a couple more years to like edit and research and fact check and all of that. And the fact that it didn't exist before made me just so excited to get the information out into the world.
Were there any writers that you discovered that you just like absolutely fell in love with?
Definitely. There were so many. You know, there are 300 plus women in the book, which is wild. I got so excited about, and we're close by geographically to them right now, which is interesting. But the fact that I thought that the book was going to start in 1900 or even a little later, you know, we all think of modern musical theater as really becoming what we know it to be today with Showboat and with book musicals. And I wasn't sure how much of, you know, pre-Showboat musical theater I would be covering. And then as I started to research, I found that there were women who were writing stage entertainments that had songs in them. And we might not necessarily think of them as like modern musicals today when Manhattan was being settled and like in the 1700s and 1800s and then the very early 1900s. And I found these women who I was just, you know, I have the theater district map memorized and I could even tell you about what it looked like, you know, 50 years ago. But do I have the like first theaters in Manhattan in the 1700s and 1800s memorized? Like, no, I know the basics, but going back to like so far long ago and really looking at anything I could find about those women, I felt very insecure at first because I felt like the first chapter of the book, which is those really early female writers, didn't have as much information. And that then eventually made me go, oh, I need to include it all the more because someone needs to say these women's names and tell their stories and put it in a book. And then maybe someone else will find, you know, even more research at some point. But it was those early women that I've been thinking about a lot. And I would walk around like the lower tip of Manhattan and really like where the first, you know, stages were built and just think about the fact that that history all happened there. It was very exciting.
Why do you think visiting those kind of spaces is important, even though sometimes the buildings are gone, everything that's ever happened is gone? But what's the significance of that space?
You know, we're all connected to each other through space more than a lot, pretty much anything else. And it was always so powerful to me. It made me feel so connected to theater history and theater legends to go, okay, like I'm sitting in the Imperial Theater and like Hal Prince did Fiddler on the Roof here. Or, you know, here I am walking by the spot where the Morosco once was. And like, this is what happened when that theater came down. It made me feel so connected to New York, to my like theatrical ancestors, to my literal ancestors. Like I find it to be so thrilling to think about the places themselves and all the people that have made great art and seen great art and had like, you know, experiences in them. It's like the thing that I feel like connects me the most to New York City. And so to get to like experience that on a new level where do you ever like, you know, when you have your favorite TV show, but like there's one episode you haven't seen. I have this with like books or like it's your favorite author, but there's one book you haven't read. Getting to discover like anew all of these lower Manhattan theater kind of corners and blocks was like that secret, you know, last episode that you finally get to watch. Except I hope it's not. I hope there's some other corner that I'm not even thinking of yet. I'm sure there is. But yeah, it was so exciting to kind of dig into some of that early pre-1900 history.
Earlier in my podcast, I had Jesse Rifkin on. I don't know if you're familiar with his work. He kind of does, he's about like physical spaces, but for music. And we talked about once like how sad it is that like venues close, but he said in order for us to create more stuff, something has to go. What are your thoughts kind of about that when we're trying to preserve theaters, but also want to create new stuff?
You know, it's such a balance and nobody has the right answer, right? Like we're all just humans with different opinions. And so someone might think, oh, we can create more work if this becomes something else. And someone else might think, no, we need to preserve, there's never a right answer. I think that's like one of the key parts of it. But I think a lot about the Great Theater Massacre of 1982 and like what he said, his quote makes me think about that immediately because, we lost 5 Broadway theaters and we gained the Marriott Marquis. And there are so many people who were around during that time and really felt the depth of that loss and who hate the Marriott Marquis because of it and that theater and, the shows in it. And it looks like a cruise ship and, whatever. But for so many of us who didn't experience those early theaters, the Marriott Marquis is like where Thoroughly Modern Millie was. And it's like where Drowsy Chaperone was. And I go to I saw Elf the other night and I was so struck by all my memories at the Marquis, and it's a magical place to me. But at the same time, I think, if I was around in 82, I would have been one of those people with Susan Sarandon and Christopher Reeve tying herself with a chain to the Morosco and the Bijou and all that. But so there's, I'm not saying they should have been demolished, but the other thing that when I was writing my 4th book, I studied quite a bit was the fact that basically all of the other Broadway theaters would not be landmarked if that massacre of theaters hadn't happened. And the reason that all the other theaters are now protected is because that happened. So there's this weird, it's not necessarily always about seeing the bright side, but there's this balance in the ecosystem that, theater is not ever going to be divorced from American capitalism. And we live in this society where, hopefully, if we get into another time where theaters are empty and shows aren't happening, there will be some ability for theater owners to, save those houses and not sell them to other real estate needs. But the thing that will protect them the most is that they're landmarked. And, we wouldn't have that without that having happened. So, I go back and forth. I don't think there's ever, a 100% right answer.
So you've been writing the books about all the theaters that exist on Broadway. How did you get into that, and how does researching a book like that or a book like Women Writing Musicals, how does that start?
Some part of me sometimes thinks that part of it was because Florida is so new. And growing up in Florida, this is so funny, but I don't know if I ever saw a building that was built before 1980. It felt like everything was that pastel 90s vibe. And as someone who was so obsessed with theater history and would read about these, musicals from decades ago and go, oh my God, how exciting. I want to picture where that happened. When I finally got a chance to go to the physical theaters in New York, I was so excited by oh my God, what does the dressing room look like? And what does the orchestra pit look like? And oh my God, this doorway looks so old. Oh wow, here's a picture I found online of it in 1950. And it looks the same as when that theater goer was here seeing that, old play. And so I feel so much of it was about the spaces being connected to the history and connected to the older shows. And then it was my first times going backstage and really exploring Broadway theaters. It was so thrilling to me, how scrappy and human they are. And you would look under a dressing room table and you would see that everyone had signed underneath it from previous shows. And the way that theater people inherently want to be connected to other productions and other people. And, oh, you have my, seat and you have my dressing room. And, oh, that's the props room that I went to when I did that show. And it's so about people. And so I think that both the magic of everything being so historic and old and also how it connected all of the shows together. When I was working on Title of Show as the assistant to the director, I spent a lot of time backstage at the Lyceum, which was so wild because it's the oldest continually operating Broadway theater. So it's been a Broadway house since 1903. And then years later, I came back producing Be More Chill. And it was so exciting to be back in that theater because there's just fascinating things everywhere you look. There's a penthouse above the theater that's now where the Schubert archives are. And it was originally owned by a producer who owned, the theater, the Lyceum at that time. And he had a secret trapdoor built in that he could open the trapdoor. And when his wife was acting on stage, she was an actor, he would wave a white handkerchief at her from the trapdoor if she was overacting. And every night at the Lyceum, I would just look up at the trapdoor and think should I go up there and wave a white handkerchief at some of my actor friends? And will they think that's funny? But it's just everywhere you look, there's oh, what's that old elevator? Oh, what's that hole in the ceiling? Oh, there's just, it's mystery. It's being inside of a castle and a maze and a theater at the same time. I just find the Broadway theaters endlessly magical.
You're going through the covers, what's this? What's that? Opening every door and getting familiar to see
People love when you do that. Yeah, I did that.
So when you started writing the books, how do you research so much? Did you do it all at once and now you're just writing it all, or do you still research as you go?
It was some of my most magical days I've ever had in New York. And I've thought about this a lot recently because I interviewed over 200 people for, oh my God, 300. Did I just say 200? Wow. I interviewed so many people for Untold Stories of Broadway, and originally I thought it was going to be one book. And as I started writing it, it became very clear that it was going to be multiple books, and eventually it'll be 6 based on how many theaters I can include in each book. But it became clear that in order to tell the full story of each theater and include like a diversity of people of different ages, backgrounds, jobs, races, genders, years they worked in the theaters, etc., it had to be this many books. And so my first year writing it, though, I did hundreds of interviews, and it was 2013, and I would schedule these days for myself where I would schedule an interview every 2 hours, and they were almost all of them. I would say like maybe I did 6 interviews of the hundreds that weren't in person. So I would literally be like, oh, I'm meeting Danny Burstein like at Riverside Park, and then I'm going to like, Graciela Danielle's apartment, and then I'm going to like backstage to interview Charlotte D'Amboise in her dressing room. And it was constantly places in New York and people in New York talking about New York. And like I literally met Lin-Manuel Miranda like in the Heights, like not the musical, the actual place. And I would just interview people at places that like restaurants that are now gone. And, there are so many people in my book that are no longer with us from these interviews in 2013 who I interviewed in their homes, Fritz Weaver or Hal Prince in his office. And so the journey of writing the books became, I call it like, it's my version of gonzo journalism, which is something I get from Hunter S. Thompson via Joe Iconis and his Hunter S. Thompson musical. But it was really like writing the books became part of the story. And it was part of why I felt so much freedom and agency to put myself in the book, because I realized that like that was part of the story. It was like this theater kid who was like running around New York discovering all of this history. And so I felt like I could put a lot of my own personal tales and connections into the interstitial stuff between the interviews, because it just was so much part of writing the books, having those interview experiences.
Because you're creating the history too.
I guess it does come back to that.
As we talk about you creating stuff, the Jonathan Larson Project, which is incredible.
We have been in auditions all day today for our understudies, and it has been so inspiring because I love our team. It's so fun to like sit at a table with people who are all such incredible artists and so kind and so excited. But also, when I started creating the Jonathan Larson Project and did all this research, so many of these songs had really not been heard by anyone. It was like we have songs in our show that Jonathan Larson wrote and they sat in a box and no one ever heard them until the Jonathan Larson Project. And then there's some songs that like he did one night at a benefit concert in 1991 that, have been heard on a stage that one time. And then there's some songs that like were in rent workshops but were never in the show. So it's all stuff that comes together to make this whole of this musical that we're so excited about. But my point about the songs and the auditions is I was sitting there watching these auditions and going, oh my God, I just realized that like for the tenor baritone cover, all of them are bringing 3 songs to audition for us that no one had ever heard until the Jonathan Larson Project. Like we just happened to, because you're selecting like, a smattering of different songs to see if people can play that role. And I was going, I'm seeing some of the most incredible actors and like people who I've admired their performances on Broadway and, just amazing people coming into this room, and they're all dedicated to bringing these songs to life in this audition. And like no one had heard these. Like it was kind of blowing my mind today and yesterday in these auditions. So we're just deep in pre-production, and it's going to be such a great show. Like I'm so excited for people to get to see what we're doing.
So I have a lot of non-theater people who listen to this podcast. So can you give like a brief glimpse of who Jonathan Larson is and why he's so important?
Absolutely. And I'm so glad you asked that, because I love kind of telling non-theater people what it's about, because I do think it's a show that so many people would enjoy if they don't have the context, and I want to make sure people have the context. So Jonathan Larson was a musical theater writer, and he passed away very unexpectedly of an aortic aneurysm at the age of 35, the night before the first preview performance of Rent off Broadway, which became a Pulitzer Prize-winning, Tony Award-winning hit, and basically fulfilled like every dream Jonathan Larson spent his whole life having for himself, but he very tragically wasn't there for it. So he was this incredible writer who he wrote Tick, Tick, Boom, which was recently made into a Netflix film directed by Lin-Manuel Miranda, which I was really lucky to have a small part working on as historian consultant. And in addition to Tick, Tick, Boom and Rent, Jonathan spent his, short but very prolific and meaningful life writing so many different projects, trying to write pop songs for the radio, trying to write musicals, trying to write for TV, writing for cabaret. And so it was so exciting, the idea of creating a new show called The Jonathan Larson Project, which will be at the Orpheum starting February 14th, that takes a lot of the work that he created that we haven't seen, but that is so brilliant. You know, there are songs in it that were so political and so relevant. And then there were songs that were really personal and were also so resonant. And it all kind of comes together in this new show where, it's 5 artists that come together on this stage and they discover Jonathan's work. And so it's not a book musical. You know, you'll come and I think you'll see a lot of stories and you'll see characters that follow certain through lines, and you'll get to feel like you're in 2025, but kind of transported to the past when Jonathan was writing the songs. But there's, a really impactful story within the show itself about just this young artist who created all this work that we've never seen before, but we finally are getting to witness.
When did you discover Jonathan Larson and fall in love with his work personally?
It was definitely the Rent cast recording for me, and I was so obsessed with Rent. And then after that, I was so obsessed with Tick, Tick, Boom. And it was seeing the tours of both shows. It was listening to the cast albums. I was Mimi popping out of a pile of Rent playbills on my bat mitzvah sign-in board, which I like to say this, and then I like to say Rent bat mitzvah girls unite at the Orpheum at 7 p.m. because I feel like there's this vibe of I feel like our show, people that are my mom's age, people are going to really, I think, enjoy this. It's their music. Jonathan Larson would have been 65, had he lived this year. And so, I think that it appeals the music to that generation and the messages of the songs. But I think there's also this nostalgia moment for those of us that ever sat on the Rent rush line or who saw Rent on tour or who just sang along to the cast album. It's even though our show is set in present day with nods to the past, some part of me just wants to dress in 1990s garb for the whole process because it's so nostalgic in such a cool way. And we're trying to figure out the balance between, we're doing a new musical, but we want to pay tribute to Rent and Tick, Tick, Boom also. So I think there's a lot of different things. And then there's also, I know so many people that are younger who wish that they were around for that. So many people whose first exposure to Jonathan Larson was the Tick, Tick, Boom film. And how fun to get to see an actual new Jonathan Larson musical for the first time with our show. You might not have gotten to see the original Rent or Tick, Tick, Boom, but here's this new Jonathan Larson musical. So I think it does bridge a number of different generations and just ways to be excited about why the show is going to hit you.
Yeah, for me with Rent, I was at the library with my mom once when I was younger, and she's like, oh, they have the Rent on DVD. Let's watch that. And I was like, what is that? She's like, it's a musical. And as a child, I was like, what is this? I should not be watching this.
That's so funny because I sometimes make fun of my mom because I was allowed to listen to any musical, including Rent, but there were certain R-rated movies I couldn't watch. And I was like, Mom, were you listening to the lyrics? It's not consistent.
Yeah. Well, and then thinking about Jonathan Larson, I found out is 2 months older than my mom. And you're oh, when you think about time and how much time kind of he missed.
He's frozen in time because he died when he was 35, so sadly. And he would have been our parents' generation for sure.
Yeah. When you were growing up, did you ever think that you'd play such an important role in preserving Jonathan Larson's legacy?
Oh my God, the most no. I think growing up, I was just I'm going to work in theater no matter what. I would always just be it's theater, theater, theater. But I just felt like I would find a place to kind of do some of this stuff I was passionate about. And some part of me always thought that was working for a producing team or working at a theater that did kind of new musicals or, there were so many different versions of that. But I feel so lucky that, so many people have given me the opportunity to bring theater history to the forefront. And the people who've done that more than anything are my bosses at 54 Below. The 4 producers of the Jonathan Larson Project, Richard Frankel, Tom Vertel, Steve Baruch, and Mark Routh, 3 of them are my bosses at 54 Below. For over a decade, they've let me bring, new musicals and new writers and underappreciated older musicals and reunion concerts and people I was obsessed with on cast albums, including a lot of Rent legacy players, Anthony and Adam to 54 Below. And they support the new generation of artists. They're producing the Jonathan Larson Project, which, started in concert at 54 Below. And so, if I hadn't gotten connected with them and been hired at 54 Below, I doubt I would have at all the footprint that that I have in terms of making theater history come back, because it's been so great to get to do that at 54 Below, and then also to have like an artistic home base so that I can, go and research the Jonathan Larson Project, or I can go and work on the Tick Tick Boom movie, or go and write this book. And I, have a flexible enough job. Of course, it's a demanding job, but it's flexible enough that I can do those things and then have like a theater, permanent home base.
And then the story just of how you got to Jonathan Larson Project is incredible, because you were in D.C. and you went to the Library of Congress.
Yeah. Right? The Library of Congress is a magical place. That and the New York Public Library are like the two havens of the world to me. Such special places. And, when Jonathan Larson passed, his family gave all of his belongings, his papers, his tapes, his recordings, and, scripts and journals and sheet music and everything to the Library of Congress. And the collection there is incredible. And I always wanted to go see it. And it's so funny because the way these things happen, I had plans to go see it. And then my good friend, Jason Sweet Tooth Williams, was cast in Freaky Friday out of town at the Signature. And it was going to see that, was like, oh, I could go see that in DC and see the Jonathan Larson papers for the first time. And so I just have these memories of seeing Freaky Friday the musical kind of like in tears and being like, am I okay? Because it was the first time I really was like, oh my God, Jonathan Larson left behind just hundreds of hours of things to listen to and read. And the tapes were remarkable because so many of them were labeled like Jonathan Larson, 1983, tape 2. And I would listen to it and I would find Rhapsody, which now is like this pinnacle moment of our show. And Rhapsody was a song that Jonathan Larson wrote in 1983, and it wasn't ever put in anything. It wasn't in a concert. It wasn't in a workshop. It wasn't in a musical development. It was a standalone song that I was floored by, and the only recording of it was like him banging on the keys in his apartment at 508 Greenwich and recording it himself. And then there was like one lyric sheet, that I found later on in a box. And so it occurred to me that in order to create the Jonathan Larson Project really well and really responsibly, I kind of had to spend enough time with the collection to listen to everything and to match up everything. And even today in auditions, I was going, oh, that lyric that we, making so many decisions for someone that's not in the room about what a final version of a song should be for our show, and going, oh, on this demo, Jonathan sang that lyric in this song, but in that lyric draft, he wrote this lyric. And, it took so much. It's a good thing I'm so type A and so obsessed with minutia, because like it took so much of kind of combining things. I started to feel like a musical theater cave explorer just because it was like endless treasures to kind of go through and figure out what could turn into a show or a concert that became a show. And so much of it like was driven by these themes that ran through Jonathan's work that I felt like a lot of what guided the songs that were selected were like, yeah, which ones are, the most amazing ones that audiences have to hear, but also how are the songs that we want to put together in a show connected to each other. And it was just exciting, and it took a while, and that was okay because it was nice to spend time with the work. And I would come home from DC back to New York, and I would just have these songs in my head and go like, I can't believe that I'm the only person that like is singing Green Street right now. And I remember like, I would sometimes email like Joe Iconis, who's my best friend and close collaborator. I would email him like one thing about a song and just be like, you're not going to believe this song, but no one could hear them yet. And I would like tweet. Remember that was back when Twitter was a thing. Like I would tweet like little lyrics that like no one had heard yet, but it's amazing. Like that's now something that a cast recording exists for, and that is going to be seen on a stage in New York City.
Did you end up going? You went through everything.
I went through
everything. Like 15,000 items, right?
So yes, I think it's so many, and I went through everything. But I will say, John Simpkins, who is our amazing director on the Jonathan Larson Project, and every day I'm so grateful that he's directing it because his take on Jonathan and on our show is just it's extraordinary. But John Simpkins and I went down to the Library of Congress together a couple months ago to do some research together. And even though I went through everything, and even though like I was like, I can't create this, there are still things where I would be like, oh, John, you have to see this. And then I'd be like, wait, I don't think I realized that connected to that. Like there's still discoveries. It's like, do you ever, I don't know if you're someone that saves a lot of stuff, but when I go through like my own storage unit and I discover things, like it's the same feeling almost where you're like, oh, I knew this was there, but I didn't realize this person worked on it. Like I didn't know them when I looked through this last time.
Yeah, when you go through like old playbills or like old shows that you worked on, you're like, huh. okay. Like,
Yes. And like some of the stuff going down with John was exciting because he was seeing some of it for the first time and, all of that. And like I remember a couple months ago on that trip, I looked through Jonathan Larson's Rolodex, and that was something that I am positive that, years ago creating the Jonathan Larson Project, I'm sure I looked at it, but I'm sure I also went like, oh, this is, helpful dramaturgical or contextual information, but it's not going to help me decide what songs to put in the show or whether it's, this music goes with that, whatever. And I think I looked at some of that stuff for context and information and moved on. And this time I literally went through every name in his Rolodex and I was like, wow, like, oh, he was connected somehow to that person. And like, oh, interesting, like what he wrote there. And so there's just levels and layers of stuff there.
At what point of visiting the archives did you realize this has to be a show?
That's a great question. So I went in with the idea that it could be a show because this started out as the most tiny miniature concert at the City Center Encores. I was part of the artist board when they were doing Encores off center. And so they created, first Janine Tesori and then Michael Friedman put together this group of young artists. And one of our tasks was to create these lobby projects before these off center productions where it would be 30 minutes long and it would complement the production that night. So before a performance of Tick, Tick, Boom, which had Lin-Manuel Miranda, Karen Olivo, and Leslie Odom Jr. in it, I was doing a miniature unheard Jonathan Larson concert, by which I mean it was 5 people and it was someone playing a keyboard and it was like on a makeshift stage in the lobby and it was great. But I picked, these 5 unheard Jonathan Larson songs that I found in various places. And it was so cool and it was so like exciting to me that I became connected to the Larson family, and it was getting connected to them and having that like miniature concert experience that led to creating the show, because I asked them like, could I ever turn this into like a full concert for 54 Below where like we would do a whole night of his songs? And they said yes. And Julie Larson really is like the person I am indebted to so much every day, because she just says yes. And the fact that she trusted me and the other people that are working on our show to put something on stage that's a brand new, creation of her brother's work. Like, she is the steward of like the legacy. And throughout the process, she's been so helpful in giving me information and giving me context, but also she has said yes, and she's let artists create in a way that I find so inspiring, and it makes me want to like give that to someone else, like pass that on. And when I said like I want to create this into a whole concert, she said yes, and so that's when I started going to the library and doing more research.
And then the concert, I went to the one in 2018, and it was incredible.
Oh my God, I'm so happy you were there.
I was like, Alexa, how again? She's like, do the Today Text Rush, and that's how I got in. And it was just...
That makes me so happy.
Yeah.
Wait, tell me what you remember about it.
I remember it was like the first time I went to 54 Below, they're like, no phones allowed. We will kick you out. And I was like, whoa, like that means it's like intense. And I remember them, like, because there was like the little kind of mini catwalk thing. It was just everything. And then the songs, and then cast recording. I think my favorite one is Valentine's Day, though.
Oh my gosh. I love that, because our first previews on Valentine's Day, which is like, we have a song called Valentine's Day, and I love that. And Jonathan Larson would love that because he loved that song. And so he would be excited that it's your fave.
Like the 1984 musical, finding about that, like interweaving the history into that show was just so fascinating.
I'm so happy you saw it. I recently looked at the guest list of like who saw it in 2018 and was like, oh, that person was there. That person was there. But, it's a relatively small number of people in terms of the amount who will get to see it now. So I'm so like excited to talk to anyone who saw it in 2018.
In 2018, did you know it was going to become something bigger?
I didn't. I really hoped that once we started working on it in 2018 and it became clear how, for lack of a better word, magical it was, I was hopeful that we would maybe be able to like license it at some point, or it would turn into a cast album, or we could publish the music, in any way that I could. I just wanted the fact that like that happened at 54 Below to not be the end of it. I wanted other people to be able to sing one of these days and sing, these songs the way that they were arranged and orchestrated by the brilliant Charlie Rosen and brought to life by our team. And so I didn't know right away that it would be a full show. And it was really like the encouragement of the producers and the fact that they optioned it. And, the producers are very successful, decades-long, mine and Alexa's bosses who've produced Hairspray and The Producers and Angels in America and many, many other plays and musicals. And they saw the potential in it being a full theater production. And so I immediately was like, yes. And how do we move this forward? And then one of the funny parts of doing the Jonathan Larson Project when we did it was that so many of us were working on Be More Chill. And it was like Lauren Marcus, George Salazar, Charlie Rosen, me, multiple other people. And so we knew that it couldn't happen right away, which it couldn't really anyway, because the show needed to get developed and, we needed to turn it into a full-scale musical. But it was that, and then it was COVID, and then it was like, how do we push this forward? And one of the really interesting things about making theater in New York, interesting and frustrating, is how much it is controlled by real estate. And so I'm not producing the show, I'm the conceiver, but I'm very tied into what the producers are trying to do, working for them every day at 54 Below as well. And so I knew with the kind of theater that we needed to get, we're waiting for these couple of specific spaces to become available on the specific timeline that works for us based on our show development. And so it's really always a guessing game. And, I believe so strongly that there's room for so many people in the theater and there's room at the table for like different voices. But the one thing that is almost inarguable is that like sometimes shows have to close in order for new shows to open. So it was, interesting going, well, maybe our show will happen here. Maybe it'll happen there. Maybe it'll happen at this time, or maybe it won't happen at all. And it was such a crazy miracle that the timing and the theater opening came together as it did, because the producers also produced Stomp at the Orpheum for many years. So theater real estate being what it is, I wish we had more large off-Broadway spaces, but the more real estate in New York becomes in demand, the fewer of those spaces we have, the more that they become office buildings or more lucrative, endeavors potentially. But even though theater is difficult to make financially successful in any era, there's never been more people that like want to do it. And there's never been more shows that want to come in. So it was so exciting to get a theater because I just didn't know if we would.
Yeah, it's so exciting. There's so much demand. And people are like, oh, the American theater is dying. I was like, everyone's waiting in line. I was listening to like the Smart List podcast and Kira Culkin. So I'm like, Glenn, Gary, Gunn Ross, they told me we're doing it. They don't have a theater yet, but
yeah, everyone's just waiting. And it's such I mean, this would make a great Monopoly game, and I've started to do it as a joke with friends a couple times and then, not gotten very far. But it's like the idea that that's part of the game. Like you have to pitch your show, and there might be 6 shows that all have the money and the cast and the creative team and the wherewithal in all ways to come in, and there's only that one theater. And you also it's part of the Untold Stories of Broadway, but you have to get a theater that financially works for the budget of the show, and there's so many different factors that come into play with which theater is correct. But at the end of the day, mostly you're just trying to get a theater with all of the people that want each theater. So it is such a big part of what gets produced. It's not just about, sometimes I would think about that with women writing musicals, of like, these are not just women who wrote musicals. It's women who wrote musicals that got produced because they got theaters. And so it's not just like, theater, the kind of theater that is made is not just predicated on what's created. It's also affected not even just by who's producing it, but also who's giving the spaces.
What are your thoughts on the current state of like Broadway and New York City theater? Because I feel like everyone has an opinion of it.
My opinion tends to always be that things go in waves and in phases, and that anytime someone is like making a, statement that's like definitive, it's always got other stuff on the other side, And by that, I mean, anytime someone's like, theater's dead, or it's too hard to make theater right now, or no original musicals make it, or this is like, what's wrong with theater? It's like, yes, but, there's always both sides. And I see that in every era of history. And granted, in many of them, I wasn't there. And so like for some of the eras I was there, I have angrier thoughts or frustrations or my own, version of events. But in general, you go, oh, like in the 80s, that was horrible that, the theaters were empty and, there were Tony seasons where there weren't even enough shows to fill the slate and how awful the 80s were. And then you go, oh my God, look at all these incredible musicals we love from the 80s and look at all this amazing art that was being made. And look at the fact that sometimes when it's not as competitive, sometimes weirder things can get through because it's like not as hard to get a theater, and sometimes not. Like sometimes it was just, Jonathan Larson trying to get his shows produced and theaters are empty and they're not happening. There's all sides of it. And so this is not to discount the fact that like part of the reason that the theaters were so empty in the 80s was of course like the AIDS crisis and how many artists we lost from that, which is tied into all of this. But in general, every era like as far as the actual shows that are made and like what's going on, you can go, oh, it sucks right now that so many shows are closing so quickly. But every time someone says that, I think, yes, but like remember when shows used to always close on opening night? And now at least there's so many times when producers pump money into things and try to help them like, have a nest egg so they can run a little bit, so they can, have a good enough footprint for licensing, for regional theater, for tours. And so it's not that I wish that any show would close quickly. It's just that like there's all different sides to every one of these equations. And at the end of the day, it's like you can't divorce theater from capitalism. And as long as costs have gone up so much, it's going to be hard to run any show. And so, like I think like always in any era, the one thing that's true is everyone can support the kind of theater that they want to exist with their dollar and with their pocketbook. And like if you can buy an expensive ticket to something and it's something you want to support because it's, a new musical or a new writer or, oh my God, this is putting like women on the stage, or this is like representing the LGBTQ plus community in a way that I want to happen on Broadway. Like the best thing you can do is buy a ticket, make your friends buy tickets, buy those tickets at the highest level you can. Like it's all just, not able to be divorced from the American system of capitalism that we all have fun under.
How to explain that to people? Because with my TikTok and stuff, I'm like, okay, here's how to get affordable tickets and stuff. But I was like, but if you can pay more, we need you to do that. That's your job, is to pay them more to like supplement the lower prices.
Totally. And it's also what you said. It's like you always want accessibility and like lower price points. Like we all want that. But in some ways, like in some systems, you can't have those unless you have the higher price points. And it's only the fact that scalping is legal, I think, has changed the game on all of this, because scalping being legal means that there has to be premium seating, because otherwise you're just paying that money that you might pay for Oh Mary to scalpers. It's only premium seating that allows that money to actually go to the show, which then, helps those producers produce other shows that might not be Oh Mary and selling out. It's like the system, because of scalping, has created these higher ticket prices, but it's also like the higher ticket prices allow for the lower ticket prices. So again, it's like this ecosystem. It really starts to sound to me a little bit like I'm describing like, the underwater community of like fish, and these eels depend on these algae. Like if I was a scientist, I would know what I was talking about. But it is an ecosystem. It is like, I can't tell you how often I'm like, oh, that show happened because that other show happened. Like, or, there's all versions of it. But I do think a lot of the accessible price points, like we should all be shouting about them. We should all be letting people know like they can see a Broadway show without paying $200. Like, of course they can. There's so many ways to do that. That is a part to shout about as well. But it's also the thing of like, if you want a certain kind of theater to happen, the best thing you can do is like pay the most you can for it.
When I do my museum videos, I'll put how much something costs, and then people be like, that's too much. And I'll be, how much do you think it should cost? Like a $15 museum? And they're like, free, because the ones in D.C. are free. I'm like, okay. I'm like,
yeah, it's crazy how like it's all related to the government. It's all related to like how things are overseen. It's all related to like, how hotels are filled and how congestion pricing affects theater. Like if we were in another country where it was subsidized by the government, we would be having different prices. But even nonprofit theater, which like is such a different system and structure, that is as dependent on money as for-profit theater. It's just a different way of looking at it. And it's like, for nonprofit theaters close all the time because they're not bringing in enough money. It's not that is divorced from capitalism or money. Again, it's just like a different way of like having donors, contribute so that people can see things. Like it's different, but it's another side of the coin because we live in America, and very sadly, it's like, I don't see this changing. Like we all are dependent on people who have resources and means to subsidize theater and to make it affordable for people that, everyone should be able to go to the theater. But I don't see it happening that like the government soon is going to swoop in and be like, here's all this subsidy money. Like if anything, the arts are getting slashed and defunded. And there's a lot of people that want to help the arts, but their money is going elsewhere to help other things right now. So, all of that is going to contribute to what we see on Broadway in the next few years as far as like what shows happen, what shows close. But the other thing that I think over and over is like, as much as we want to go, oh my God, people are only paying for like commercial ideas and movie adaptations and all these things, things. Like, it's just not true. And so often the best musical of the season is like the unexpected show, the show that comes from off Broadway, the new musical, the original musical. And so there will continue to be like amazing investors and producers that invest their money and their resources in those shows. And then those shows become the big hits. And so as long as we have that, you know, there's always going to be both. There's always going to be all kinds of different musicals that close quickly and that become hits, and it's not predictable.
I did theater for a while, and now I've been working in music. And when people are like, oh, this show sucks, I'm like, well, it got people employed. Like, when people were talking about All In, I was like, well, people got to be employed the entire holiday season, and the Banksons made it to Broadway. So for that, you should say thank you, John Mulaney, for putting your face on that thing.
It's also like, I really deeply don't feel like there are bad shows. Like, I really am someone who thinks like All In, which I haven't seen and I don't really have an opinion on, I haven't seen it yet, but like that's someone's favorite show. Like, someone is going to see that like a couple of times and going like, this is my favorite play. And so I really just think there are like shows for you and shows for someone else. Like, there's different opinions. There's shows that I don't like that have run for a million years. There's shows that I love that have run for a million years. Like, there's no perfect like kind of say to it. And I think also my number one thing I always tell people, like, I don't love when people ask for theater recommendations, like whether, you know, when someone's coming to New York and they're like, what should I see? I'm like, well, the thing is, like, the beautiful thing about theater is, like, I don't ever feel like there's just one must-see show. I feel like, oh, did you like this and this? Oh, maybe then you'll like that. Or, like, hey, read about these 10 things and, like, figure out which one sounds exciting to you. Because the way that we have shows that run for longer and we don't all funnel everything into, like, the one hit of the season is people making their own individual opinions. You know, people deciding themselves, like, oh, Swept Away sounds interesting. Like, I'm going to go for that. Oh, wow, I'm really surprised. Like, that really struck me. And so, like, as long as we have the group think of it all, theater suffers. But if we have the like, hey, like, check out all these things and decide which one is exciting to you, theater thrives.
Is there any shows that you've been really loving right now or that have been really exciting that you maybe wouldn't recommend based on your thoughts, but just something that you love?
No, it's a perfectly fair question. The sad thing is my answer for a very long time was Teeth, which closed. So I'll have to think of another. I loved Teeth so much. But honestly, the answer to that is I look at what's coming up in this spring, and I'm so excited that the Jonathan Larson Project is starting previews February 14th and opening March 10th because A, I'm excited for us to get in front of audiences before the spring season goes nutso. But also, like, I myself have so many shows that this spring I'm like, oh my God, I have 20 shows on my must-see list. Like, there's so much. Like, I can't believe I'm going to get to see Floyd Collins with Jeremy Jordan at Lincoln Center. Like, that's so thrilling. I'm really excited for You're in Town, like at Encores. There's so many things that are on my, like, they're opening very soon list. What about you? What are you excited about?
Well, I also got tickets for Floyd Collins. What else am I excited for? So I think we'll finally get to see Death Becomes Her.
Yes.
I'm excited for the new Joshua Harmon play that's going to be at MTC.
Me too.
He's like my favorite. I saw Significant Other in college and I was like, oh my God. And I've just been a ride or die for him since then.
I can't wait to see that play too. I forgot about it for a moment. And I love Death Becomes Her. Like, I saw it a second time and was like, this is old school Broadway glamour to the extreme. Like, I love that show.
I've gone through it. I made like a list and I'm like, okay, let's try to like book all these things before they sell out. And then I miss it and then I'm sad.
Yeah. Normally that's me on a week to week, day to day basis. But right now, because we're like about to go into hardcore like rehearsals, previews, I'm like, okay, we're hitting pause. But like March 11th, watch out because like I'm going to be seeing a lot of things.
You're like, I'm going to be on the loose, ready to see everything now.
Yeah.
What does it feel like to be such an integral part of the New York community that you grew up loving?
Thank you for saying that because honestly, sometimes I do feel like one of the things I love about 54 Below is like it's a little bit outside of theater because we're not working on actual productions that run 8 shows a week, right? So it's the thing I love about it is like I get to work with a lot of artists a little bit on a day-to-day basis and like I get to be enjoying theater because I'm not always going like, oh man, when are we gonna, compete against that show or do that? So sometimes I feel a little bit removed from it in that way, but then a lot of the time I'm really like shocked when artists who I grew up obsessed with will like, I'll see them on the street and wave hello, or like someone will email me and I'll just be like, I can't believe that person's emailing me. Like it still truly happens on a daily basis, like literally daily, where I'm like, I can't believe I'm walking into this rehearsal studio and like that Broadway show is rehearsing next door and I know people there. Like it never gets old. And I think that the key to it never getting old is being so excited by New York itself all the time. Like, I wake up every day and feel so lucky to be in New York, and like I would never want to be anywhere else. And I just can't imagine ever picturing wanting to be anywhere else. And so the fact that like I am connected to all of these people because we're all here is never lost on me. It never gets old. And I'm still a fangirl. Like, I'm still a fangirl in everything I work on. And I encourage other people to be fan people as well.
And so the final question I've been asking people is, what's been bringing you joy?
I feel like weirdly I just said it, which is like I am reminded all the time, and especially in a post-COVID world, how lucky I am to live in New York and how lucky I am to live in New York not in COVID. Not that it wasn't, delightful to be here during that time as well, because it's always New York or nothing, New York or nowhere. But the thing that brings me joy every day is like waking up and being able to go anywhere in New York City.
So where can the people find you and follow you to learn more about all of your endeavors?
People can find me at Jen Ash Tep, the first three letters of each of my names, Jen Ash Tep, at Instagram or at the artist formerly known as Twitter, I guess, now known as X. I've been contemplating what's really weird. This is the longest answer to your question. Like, I hate that platform for so many reasons now, but there are still people on there that are people I connected with over the Jonathan Larson Project. So I keep being like, do I go back there? Anyway, if you're on there, at Jen Ash Tep, or, follow me on Facebook, all those old-fashioned places.
And then the Jonathan Larson Project begins previews at the Orpheum Theater on February 14th, and tickets are on sale. And then purchase a copy of Women Writing Musicals and the Untold History of Broadway. There's so many ways that you can support Jen and help make theater happen.
Thank you for having me. And thank you for all of this. And yes, you can also find me at the Orpheum Theater starting February 14th.
This has been The Next Stop Is with Jane August. You can follow me, Jane, at Jane August on Instagram and TikTok. The Next Stop Is recorded at Brick House in downtown Brooklyn. It premieres on Brooklyn Free Speech Radio. You can listen to other episodes in the same place you're listening to this one.